The most touching moment came 3 months after the fight, when Seagal appeared at a youth boxing program in Philadelphia that Rocky had supported for decades, the same gym where many of the city's greatest champions had learned their craft. He spoke to young fighters about the importance of humility, authentic training, and the difference between movie magic and real skill development. His message was simple but powerful. He had spent decades believing his own mythology, constructing an elaborate fantasy about his fighting abilities, and it had taken one perfectly placed punch to teach him that true strength came from honest self-assessment and continuous improvement, rather than assumed superiority or manufactured mystique. "I want you kids to learn from my mistakes," Seagal told the assembled young boxers, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his public speaking for decades. "For years, I convinced myself that I was something I wasn't. I believed my own marketing, my own press releases, my own fantasy about what I could do in a real fight. And when reality finally caught up with me, it hurt. Not just physically, but in here." He tapped his chest. "Don't let anybody, including yourselves, convince you that you're better than you are. Earn your confidence through honest work, real sparring, legitimate competition. There are no shortcuts to becoming a real fighter, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something that isn't real." The young fighters listened with rapt attention, recognizing something authentic in his words that they had never heard from him before. These kids had grown up on action movies and video games, many of them harboring fantasies about becoming great fighters through secret techniques or mystical training methods. Seagal's transformation from arrogant movie star to humble student served as a powerful reality check, helping them understand that genuine skill required years of patient, honest work rather than flashy demonstrations or theoretical knowledge. Rocky, characteristically, handled his victory with the same grace he had shown in defeat throughout his career, using the renewed attention and cultural influence to promote values that extended far beyond boxing. He used his platform to promote youth boxing programs and speak about the values that combat sports could teach: discipline, respect, perseverance, and the understanding that everyone has something to learn from everyone else. He never mocked Seagal's previous arrogance or claimed superiority over other fighting disciplines, instead focusing on the positive aspects of what had occurred. Two men testing themselves honestly, and both learning something valuable in the process. "Steven showed courage getting in that ring with me," Rocky said during a television interview weeks after the fight. "That took guts, and I respect that. What happened after, the way he's been training, the way he's been learning, the way he's been teaching kids about being honest with themselves, that takes even more courage. He's become a better man because of what happened, and that's worth more than any knockout punch could ever be." But until the fight's Rocky versus Seagal, the ultimate showdown. What happens when arrogance meets true skill? When Hollywood ego collides with Philadelphia heart? When a man who believes his own mythology faces someone who's lived through actual hell and emerged stronger? Tonight, you're about to witness something that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about real strength, authentic power, and what it truly means to be a champion. This isn't just a fight. It's a collision between two worlds, two philosophies, two completely different understandings of what makes a warrior. Hit that like button if you're ready for this journey, because what you're about to see will shock you to your core and change how you view strength forever. The MGM Grand Arena in Las Vegas buzzed with an electric energy that only comes when worlds collide. 20,000 seats packed to capacity, cameras rolling from every conceivable angle, and the kind of tension in the air that makes your skin crawl with anticipation. This wasn't just any exhibition match. This was ego versus legend, Hollywood versus the streets of Philadelphia, manufactured mystique against earned respect. The betting odds heavily favored Seagal, not because of his fighting record, but because of his reputation, his size advantage, and the public's fascination with his mystical martial arts persona. Sports commentators struggled to find precedent for this matchup, calling it everything from the most intriguing crossover fight in history to a dangerous mismatch that should never have been sanctioned. Steven Seagal, the self-proclaimed martial arts master who had dominated action movies for decades, strutted around the ring like he owned not just the arena, but the entire concept of fighting itself. His black silk GI flowed dramatically with each exaggerated movement, his ponytail swishing as he performed elaborate kata demonstrations that drew thunderous cheers from his devoted fans. Every gesture was calculated for maximum visual impact, every stance designed to project an aura of mystical power and unquestionable superiority. Seagal's entourage surrounded the ring like disciples around a guru, all nodding approval at their master's display of supposed superiority, their faces reflecting the absolute certainty that they were witnessing the warm-up of an inevitable victor. The martial arts master moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting forms and techniques in controlled environments, every motion precise and aesthetically pleasing. He demonstrated pressure point strikes against imaginary opponents, his hands moving with lightning speed through complex patterns that looked devastating to untrained eyes. His breathing was controlled and meditative, his expression serene with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his chosen element. The crowd gasped and applauded at each demonstration, many of them seeing these techniques for the first time and being genuinely impressed by their apparent sophistication and deadliness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Seagal announced into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension and theatrical gravitas. "Tonight, you'll witness the difference between real martial arts mastery and—" He paused for dramatic effect, gesturing dismissively toward the opposite corner, with the kind of theatrical contempt usually reserved for stage villains, whatever that primitive display is supposed to represent. Leisure. The crowd erupted in a mixture of boos and cheers, clearly divided between those who bought into Seagal's mystique and those who recognized genuine heart when they saw it. The martial arts master had spent the entire press tour systematically mocking Rocky Balboa's unorthodox style, calling it sloppy street fighting, an embarrassment to the combat arts, and the kind of crude brawling that gives real martial arts a bad name. During those press conferences, Seagal had demonstrated complex joint locks and pressure point techniques to reporters, explaining in elaborate detail how he could end any fight in seconds using ancient knowledge that most fighters could never hope to understand. His arrogance wasn't just confidence, it was complete dismissal of his opponent's decades of heart, determination, and proven results in the ring against the world's most dangerous fighters. He'd brought charts and diagrams showing the human body's vulnerable points, lecturing journalists about the sophisticated science behind his fighting system while dismissing boxing as barbaric and outdated. The media ate it up, creating a narrative of sophisticated martial arts mastery versus primitive, pugilistic brutality. The cameras captured every smirk, every dismissive wave, every moment of Seagal's theatrical superiority complex as he continued his pre-fight routine. He shadowboxed against invisible opponents, his movements precise and rehearsed, but somehow lacking the raw authenticity that true fighters possess. His technique was undeniably impressive from a visual standpoint. Every kick perfectly balanced, every hand technique executed with textbook precision, every transition flowing seamlessly into the next movement. His team cheered louder with each demonstration, feeding the ego that had grown monstrous over years of unopposed Hollywood action sequences and sycophantic praise from people who had never seen real combat. Seagal looked toward Rocky's corner with the kind of pity usually reserved for lost causes, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment as if saddened by the mismatch he was about to demonstrate. He'd already won this fight in his mind weeks ago, and everyone could see it written across his face in bold letters. The betting odds reflected this confidence. with most gamblers putting their money on a first-round knockout in Seagal's favor. Sports analysts predicted that Rocky's age and traditional boxing limitations would be no match for the versatility and mystical power of comprehensive martial arts mastery. Even Rocky's supporters seemed nervous, wondering if their hero had finally bitten off more than he could chew. But something felt profoundly different about the atmosphere when Rocky Balboa finally emerged from his corner, and the change was immediately palpable to anyone who understood the subtle energies that define great fighters. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance music, no elaborate costume or choreographed routine. Just a man in simple boxing trunks and worn leather gloves that had seen 1,000 training sessions and 100 real fights against opponents who had genuinely wanted to hurt him. His grey hair was neatly trimmed, his weathered face bearing the honest scars of someone who had earned every victory through blood, sweat, and an unbreakable spirit that had been forged in the fires of genuine adversity. The crowd's energy shifted subtly but unmistakably. Those who knew boxing history understood they were looking at something increasingly rare in modern sports. Authentic greatness that never needed to announce itself. Rocky moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone except himself, and everything about his demeanor spoke of a man who had made peace with both victory and defeat long ago. He didn't play to the cameras or acknowledge the crowd's mixed reaction, showing no interest in the theatrical aspects of the event that seemed to consume his opponent. His team was small and unpretentious, composed of longtime friends and trainers who had been with him through every championship fight, every comeback, every moment when the world counted him out and wrote his obituary, only to watch him rise again stronger than before. Adrian's memory seemed to hover around him like a protective aura, giving him strength that no martial arts technique could replicate or counter, a spiritual power that came from love rather than ego. The contrast between the two fighters was striking and entirely intentional, representing two completely different philosophies of what strength meant and how it should be expressed. Seagal represented everything flashy and manufactured about combat sports, the movie magic, the choreographed violence, the manufactured drama that sold tickets but lacked any connection to the brutal reality of actual fighting. His approach was all about presentation, about convincing audiences of his superiority through visual spectacle and mystical authority, rather than through the simple, honest process of proving himself against legitimate opposition under real conditions. Rocky embodied something deeper and more authentic, the working-class hero who had climbed from the streets of Philadelphia to the pinnacle of boxing through nothing but heart, determination, and an absolute refusal to quit when life knocked him down. His scars told stories that no amount of movie makeup could replicate. His calloused hands spoke of countless hours hitting heavy bags and sparring with hungry opponents. His quiet confidence came from having been tested in every way a man could be tested and finding that he was strong enough to endure whatever the world threw at him. The arena felt this difference, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what they were sensing. Something primal was about to unfold, something that would separate the pretenders from the champions in the most definitive way possible. When the referee called both fighters to center ring for final instructions, the physical differences became immediately apparent to everyone in attendance. Seagal stood several inches taller, his reach advantage obvious, his martial arts background theoretically giving him a significant edge in versatility and technical options. His physique was impressive, clearly maintained through years of disciplined training, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously tested. He looked down at Rocky with barely concealed amusement, as if wondering why this aging boxer was even sharing the same space as someone of his obvious superiority. His eyes held the dismissive certainty of someone who had spent so long believing his own mythology that he could no longer distinguish between reputation and reality. Rocky looked up calmly, meeting Seagal's condescending gaze without flinching, without anger, without anything except the quiet acknowledgement that soon, very soon, all the talking would be over and only truth would remain. His eyes held something that Seagal had never encountered in his carefully controlled world of movie sets and choreographed sequences. The steady, unblinking stare of someone who had stared into the abyss of his own limitations and emerged not bitter or broken, but somehow stronger and more complete. This wasn't the desperate intensity of a fighter trying to psyche out his opponent. This was the serene confidence of a man who had made peace with whatever outcome awaited him. The crowd held its collective breath as both men returned to their corners for the final moments before battle, the tension in the arena becoming almost suffocating in its intensity. Seagal's team surrounded him like a council of war, reminding him of pressure points and joint locks, discussing strategy as if this were a complex chess match requiring intellectual superiority and tactical brilliance to win. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about ancient techniques and mystical knowledge, their confidence absolute and unquestioned. His corner felt like a temple to martial arts mysticism, complete with diagrams of nerve clusters and philosophical quotes about the warrior's path to enlightenment through combat. Rocky's corner was quieter, more focused, carrying the weight of genuine experience rather than theoretical knowledge. His trainers offered simple, practical advice, just reminders about breathing, staying loose, trusting the instincts that had carried him through a legendary career against opponents who had genuinely wanted to destroy him. There were no elaborate strategies or complex game plans, just the fundamental wisdom that had been passed down through generations of real fighters. Stay calm, watch for opportunities, and never give up no matter what happens. Mickey's spirit seemed to whisper in his ear, offering the same practical guidance that had carried him through every significant fight of his career. The bell would ring soon, and when it did, Hollywood would meet Philadelphia. Ego would meet humility. Manufactured mystique would collide with earned respect, and the world would discover which approach to combat truly mattered when everything was on the line. The anticipation was electric. With 20,000 people and millions of television viewers worldwide about to witness something that would challenge their fundamental assumptions about strength, skill, and what it really meant to be a warrior. Vegas bookmakers were still taking last-minute bets, with most money flowing toward the martial arts master, despite the growing unease among experienced fight fans who sensed something was about to go very differently than expected. But what Steven Seagal didn't know, what his arrogance and years of choreographed movie fights had completely blinded him to, was that he was about to face something his elaborate techniques and mystical training had never prepared him for. The heart of a true champion who had spent a lifetime learning that real strength comes not from what you can do to others, but from what you can endure and still keep fighting. He was about to discover the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, between assumed authority and earned respect, between the controlled environment of movie sets and the brutal honesty of genuine competition. The lesson was coming, delivered at the speed of a perfectly placed left hook, and it would change everything. The bell rang with a sharp clarity that cut through the arena's noise, like a blade through silk, and the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Seagal immediately assumed his traditional martial arts stance, hands positioned in a classical defensive formation that looked impressive under the bright lights, his feet planted in the precise positioning that had been drilled into him through decades of form practice. His movements were fluid and precise, exactly as they had been in dozens of action movies, each step calculated for maximum visual impact rather than practical effectiveness. The crowd gasped at the beauty of his technique, the way he seemed to flow like water while maintaining perfect balance and control. He circled Rocky with the predatory confidence of someone who had spent years believing his own mythology, occasionally throwing lightning-fast hand combinations into the air to demonstrate his speed and technique to the crowd. Each movement was a masterpiece of choreographed violence, perfectly executed, but somehow lacking the raw, desperate edge that characterized real fighting. His breathing remained controlled and meditative, his expressions serene with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to question his own abilities under genuine pressure. The martial arts master was putting on a clinic in technical precision, but experienced fighters in the crowd began to notice something troubling about his approach. Rocky, in stark contrast, took his traditional boxing stance. Nothing fancy, nothing designed for the cameras, just the fundamental positioning that had served him well through countless battles against the world's most dangerous fighters. His guard was high but relaxed, his footwork economical rather than flashy, every movement born from necessity rather than showmanship. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical flourishes, just the practical efficiency of someone who had learned that in real fighting, style points didn't matter, only results did. The crowd could sense the fundamental difference in approach. One man fighting for the camera, another fighting from the soul. Seagal launched into an elaborate series of kicks and hand strikes that whistled through the air inches from Rocky's head. Each technique perfectly executed, but somehow lacking the devastating impact they appeared to possess. His kicks were technically perfect, chambered correctly, executed with textbook precision, recovered with proper balance. His hand techniques flowed seamlessly from one to the next, demonstrating the kind of technical mastery that took years to develop. But something was missing. Something that only real fighters could identify, the intent to actually hurt his opponent. These were demonstration techniques, beautiful but bloodless, impressive but ultimately ineffective. The martial arts master's strategy became immediately apparent to those who understood fighting. He intended to overwhelm Rocky with complexity, using techniques the boxer had never encountered in traditional boxing matches. Spinning kicks aimed at pressure points, grappling attempts designed to off-balance and control, pressure point strikes that theoretically could end fights instantly. His arsenal was vast and varied, drawing from multiple martial arts disciplines and representing decades of study and practice. But as impressive as it looked, experienced fighters began to notice that despite all his technical brilliance, nothing was actually landing with the force necessary to affect his opponent. Rocky absorbed or deflected each attack with minimal effort, his decades of ring experience allowing him to read and respond to threats his mind didn't fully understand, but his body instinctively countered. He didn't need to understand the theoretical basis behind Seagal's techniques. His fighting instincts, honed through years of genuine combat, automatically adjusted to neutralize whatever came his way. Every subtle shift in weight, every slight telegraph of incoming attacks, every pattern in his opponent's movement registered in Rocky's consciousness and was answered with appropriate defensive measures. Minutes passed with Seagal dominating visually while accomplishing nothing substantially, and this paradox began to create unease among knowledgeable observers. His elaborate combinations looked devastating to casual viewers, the kind of techniques that would have ended fights instantly in action movies. But boxing purists could see the fundamental flaw: technique without power, complexity without effectiveness, flash without substance. It was like watching a master pianist play a beautiful concerto while the piano remained unplugged, technically perfect, but producing no meaningful sound. Rocky remained patient, weathering the storm of ineffective techniques while studying his opponent's patterns and timing with the calculating mind of a true champion. This was what separated champions from pretenders: the ability to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly while being attacked, to find opportunity within apparent disadvantage. He had learned this lesson through years of facing opponents who possessed superior speed, reach, or technical skills, discovering that patience and ring intelligence could overcome almost any physical advantage. While Seagal expended tremendous energy on his flashy attacks, Rocky conserved his strength and gathered information about his opponent's tendencies. Seagal's confidence began showing hairline cracks as his most devastating techniques failed to produce the expected results. His breathing became slightly labored from the energy expenditure of his flashy attacks, while Rocky remained composed and economical in his movements. The martial arts master had been trained to end fights quickly with precise techniques, but he had never developed the cardiovascular conditioning necessary for extended combat against a truly skilled opponent. His movie fight scenes lasted only minutes and could be shot in multiple takes, allowing for rest between sequences. This was different. This was sustained combat against someone who refused to cooperate with the script. The crowd's energy shifted subtly as those who understood fighting began to realize that the supposed domination they were witnessing was actually an elaborate display of ineffectiveness. Seagal threw combinations that would have looked devastating in movie choreography, but lacked the fundamental power and accuracy necessary for real combat. His kicks, while technically perfect, weren't generating the force needed to damage a conditioned fighter. His pressure point strikes were landing on empty air or being deflected by Rocky's simple but effective defensive positioning. The gap between theory and practice was becoming increasingly apparent with each passing minute. Then something changed in Rocky's demeanor, and experienced fighters in the crowd could sense the shift immediately. The patient-student phase was ending, and the championship fighter was awakening. He began to press forward slightly, cutting off angles, making Seagal work harder for positioning. It wasn't dramatic or obvious to casual observers, but to those who understood boxing, it was like watching a master craftsman begin to work. Rocky's footwork became more aggressive, his guard tighter, his eyes focused with laser-like intensity on his opponent's center mass. The hunter was becoming the hunted. His jab, that simple, fundamental punch that had carried him through a legendary career, began finding its mark with increasing regularity. Nothing flashy, nothing complicated, just perfect timing and decades of muscle memory placing leather exactly where it needed to be. Each jab was like a statement. This is how fighting actually works. No spinning, no pressure points, no mystical techniques, just the basic tools of boxing applied with championship-level precision and timing. The crowd began to appreciate the beauty of fundamental excellence. The way Rocky made the simple look elegant through perfect execution. Seagal's arrogance transformed into confusion as his elaborate defensive techniques proved inadequate against boxing's most basic weapon. The jab didn't look impressive to untrained eyes, didn't involve spinning or jumping or pressure points, but it found its target with mechanical precision that no amount of martial arts theory could counter. Each punch disrupted Seagal's timing, forced him to reset his positioning, and gradually broke down the rhythm that his techniques required to be effective. Rocky's jab was like water wearing away stone, individually insignificant, but cumulatively devastating. Rocky's footwork, previously dismissed by Seagal as primitive, proved perfectly designed for closing distance and creating angles that made defense nearly impossible. Every step had purpose, every movement created new problems for his opponent to solve. The Philadelphia fighter was conducting a clinic in fundamental effectiveness versus theoretical complexity, demonstrating that mastery of basics would always triumph over elaborate techniques lacking solid foundation. His approach was surgical in its precision, economic in its execution, and devastating in its cumulative effect. The arena's energy reached a crescendo as Rocky began to stalk his opponent methodically, his approach relentless but controlled. Seagal, for the first time in the fight, showed genuine concern. His elaborate techniques required distance and timing, but Rocky was systematically eliminating both advantages through simple, relentless pressure. The martial arts master found himself being forced into purely defensive mode. His offensive capabilities neutralized by an approach so basic it seemed impossible that it could be working against his sophisticated skill set. His years of training in controlled environments had never prepared him for this kind of sustained pressure from an opponent who refused to be impressed by flashy techniques. The crowd sensed the momentum shift and began to respond accordingly, with Rocky's supporters growing louder while uncertainty crept into the cheers for Seagal. Those who had bet heavily on the martial arts master began to look worried, while experienced fighters nodded knowingly as they watched fundamental skills systematically dismantle theoretical knowledge. The fight was becoming a masterclass in the difference between what looked impressive and what actually worked, between complexity and effectiveness, between assumed superiority and earned competence. Seagal's elaborate stances, so impressive in demonstration, became liabilities under sustained pressure. His wide theatrical positioning left him off balance and vulnerable to Rocky's simple combinations. His complex defensive patterns, designed for controlled sparring sessions, proved inadequate against the relentless forward pressure of someone who had spent his entire career learning how to break down defensive fighters. Every technique that Seagal attempted was met with a counter so simple and effective that it made the original attack look foolish in retrospect. The psychological impact became as devastating as the physical pressure. Seagal had built his entire identity around being the superior fighter, the martial arts master who could dominate any opponent through his vast knowledge and mystical techniques. Now, he was being systematically outfought by someone using nothing more than basic boxing fundamentals. His confidence, so absolute just minutes earlier, began to crumble as the gap between his self-image and reality became impossible to ignore. The crowd could see it in his eyes, the dawning realization that everything he had believed about himself might be wrong. Rocky's pressure was patient but inexorable, like a force of nature that couldn't be stopped or reasoned with. He didn't rush or become reckless. Instead, he maintained perfect discipline while gradually increasing the intensity of his attack. His combinations were simple but devastating, each punch thrown with the accumulated wisdom of thousands of rounds against world-class opposition. There was no desperation in his approach, no wild swinging or emotional outbursts, just the methodical application of superior skill and ring intelligence. But what Steven Seagal still didn't understand, what his years of movie magic and theoretical martial arts study had failed to teach him, was that fighting isn't about the most complex technique or the most impressive demonstration. Fighting is about will, heart, and the ability to impose your strength on someone who doesn't want to accept it. It's about the capacity to endure punishment while maintaining focus, to stay calm under extreme pressure, and to find ways to win when everything seems to be going wrong. And Rocky Balboa was about to provide a masterclass in exactly what that meant, delivered through the most fundamental weapon in boxing, a perfectly timed left hook that would end not just the fight, but Seagal's entire mythology in one devastating moment. Martial arts study had failed to teach him was that fighting isn't about the most complex technique or the most impressive demonstration. Fighting is about will, heart, and the ability to impose your strength on someone who doesn't want to accept it. And Rocky Balboa was about to provide a masterclass in exactly what that meant. The moment that would define everything came without warning or build-up, emerging from the controlled chaos of combat like lightning from a clear sky. Rocky had been systematically breaking down Seagal's defenses with his relentless jab, each punch chipping away at the martial artist's confidence and positioning like a craftsman dismantling a house brick by brick. The accumulation of damage wasn't dramatic or obvious to casual observers, but experienced fighters could see that Seagal was being slowly and methodically broken down by the most basic weapon in boxing, applied with championship-level precision and timing. Seagal, growing increasingly desperate as his elaborate techniques continued to prove ineffective against Rocky's simple but devastating approach, decided to attempt one of his most spectacular and theoretically devastating techniques. a spinning back fist that required perfect timing, distance and positioning to be effective. It was the kind of technique that looked incredible in movies, the sort of spinning strike that could knock out multiple opponents in choreographed fight scenes. As he committed to the complex movement, turning his back momentarily to generate power through rotational force, Rocky saw the opening that champions live for. A moment of vulnerability that lasted only a split second, but was long enough for someone with his experience and ring intelligence. The left hook that followed wasn't the most powerful punch Rocky had ever thrown, nor was it the most technically perfect strike of his long and storied career. It was simply perfectly timed, launched with the kind of instinctive precision that comes from a lifetime of real fighting experience against opponents who genuinely wanted to hurt him. As Seagal completed his spin and began to face forward again, expecting to land his devastating back fist on Rocky's jaw, Rocky's fist was already traveling on its inevitable path toward his opponent's exposed chin. The punch was thrown with all the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime, spent learning the brutal lessons of professional boxing. The physics of the collision were brutal and unforgiving. Seagal's forward momentum, generated by his spinning technique, met Rocky's perfectly timed counterpunch in a meeting of forces that multiplied the impact exponentially. The punch landed with a sound that cut through the arena's noise like thunder. Not the hollow thwack of movie punches or the sharp crack of breaking boards, but the solid, sickening connection of knuckle meeting bone with devastating efficiency. It was the sound of reality asserting itself over fantasy, of authentic skill defeating manufactured mystique. Steven Seagal's eyes widened in the split second before the impact registered fully in his brain. That frozen moment when the mind processes information faster than conscious thought can follow. In that eternal instant, every assumption he had made about this fight, about his opponent, about his own invincibility, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The punch lifted him slightly off his feet, not from its raw power alone, but from the perfect leverage and timing that multiplied its effectiveness exponentially. His elaborate martial arts stance, his defensive positioning, his years of theoretical training, none of it mattered in the face of fundamental boxing executed at championship level. The martial arts master crashed to the canvas with the kind of finality that makes entire arenas fall silent. His body hitting the mat with the dead weight of someone whose consciousness had been temporarily disconnected from reality by precisely applied force. It wasn't a dramatic movie fall with rolling and recovery options. It was the immediate, total collapse of someone whose nervous system had been shut down by trauma. Seagal's ponytail spread across the canvas like spilled ink, his silk gi twisted and torn, his aura of invincibility shattered as completely as if it had never existed. The referee immediately began his count, but experienced observers could tell that this fight was already over. The silence that followed the knockdown was more deafening than any cheer could have been. 20,000 people sat in stunned amazement, trying to process what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. The supposed master of multiple martial arts, the action hero who had dominated movie screens for decades, lay motionless on the canvas, while the old boxer stood above him with the calm dignity of someone who had simply done what needed to be done. Rocky didn't celebrate or taunt. He simply stepped back and waited, showing the same respect for a fallen opponent that had characterized his entire career, even in his moment of absolute vindication. Cameras captured every angle of Seagal's defeat, but no slow-motion replay could fully convey the symbolic weight of what had just occurred in that ring. This wasn't just one man knocking out another in a sporting contest. This was the collision between authentic skill and manufactured reputation, between earned respect and assumed superiority, between the gritty streets of Philadelphia and the polished studios of Hollywood. The punch had been thrown by Rocky's fist, but it carried the weight of every real fighter who'd ever been dismissed by flashy pretenders, every authentic warrior who had been overshadowed by theatrical posturing. As the count reached 8, Seagal stirred slightly, his martial arts training automatically attempting to restore his fighting stance, even as his consciousness struggled to return from the void where Rocky's punch had sent it. His body moved through muscle memory, trying to execute the defensive positions that had been drilled into him through decades of practice. But his coordination was shattered and his sense of balance completely compromised. The damage was done, not just to his body, but to his legend, his reputation, and his entire understanding of what combat actually meant. Every person in that arena, every viewer watching at home, had seen the Emperor revealed without clothes, witnessed the moment when theoretical knowledge met practical application, and was found catastrophically wanting. The elaborate techniques that had made him famous, the mystical martial arts knowledge he had claimed as his own, the sneering superiority with which he had dismissed Rocky's primitive boxing, all of it had crumbled before one perfectly placed punch from a fighter who had never claimed to be anything more than he actually was. The knockout wasn't just a physical defeat, it was the complete destruction of a mythology that had been built on Hollywood magic rather than authentic fighting skill. Every martial arts instructor who had ever claimed their techniques were superior to boxing. Every action movie that had portrayed elaborate fighting styles as automatically superior to fundamental skills. Every assumption about the superiority of complex over simple. All of it lay shattered on the canvas alongside Seagal's unconscious form. The referee reached 10, his final count echoing through the stunned arena like a funeral bell, and the fight was officially over. Rocky Balboa had knocked out Steven Seagal with a single punch. But more than that, he had exposed the difference between authentic greatness and manufactured mystique in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible. In that moment, every real fighter in the world felt vindicated, while every pretender suddenly had to question what they thought they knew about combat, about strength, and about the difference between reputation and reality. But the real lesson was still to come, as Steven Seagal slowly struggled to his feet and faced the aftermath of his humiliation, the complete destruction of everything he had believed about himself and his place in the hierarchy of fighting men. The journey from arrogant master to humble student was about to begin, and it would prove to be more transformative than any victory could have been. Steven Seagal rose from the canvas like a man awakening from a nightmare, except this nightmare was unfolding in front of 20,000 witnesses and millions of television viewers worldwide, broadcast in high definition to every corner of the globe. His legs trembled slightly as he accepted the referee's steadying hand, his famous ponytail disheveled and his silk jai bearing the dust and humiliation of defeat. The martial arts master who had entered the ring with absolute confidence in his superiority now looked around with the confused, vulnerable expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered by a single moment of brutal reality. For the first time in his adult life, Seagal's face showed something his fans had never seen: genuine vulnerability, confusion, and the dawning realization that everything he had believed about himself might have been an elaborate self-deception. The arrogance that had defined his public persona for decades was gone, replaced by something raw and honest that his closest associates had never witnessed. His eyes darted around the arena, taking in the shocked faces of spectators who had expected to see him dominate, but instead had witnessed his complete humiliation. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone with his training, his knowledge, his supposed mastery of multiple fighting disciplines be knocked unconscious by a single punch from an aging boxer? The crowd's reaction was unlike anything ever heard in a combat sports arena, defying every expectation and precedent for how audiences respond to fight outcomes. It wasn't the typical celebration of victory or disappointment of defeat. It was the collective gasp of an audience processing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the world worked, their basic assumptions about skill, reputation, and the nature of combat itself. Half the arena had expected Seagal's martial arts mastery to dominate the aging boxer, while the other half had hoped for Rocky's heart to overcome technical superiority. Nobody, absolutely nobody, had expected to witness such a complete and devastating exposure of the difference between real and manufactured skill. The silence that followed was pregnant with meaning, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the simple outcome of a sporting event. This was a cultural moment, a paradigm shift that would be referenced and analyzed for years to come. Sports commentators struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed, while social media exploded with reactions ranging from complete disbelief to vindication of long-held suspicions about the gap between movie fighting and actual combat effectiveness. Rocky approached his fallen opponent with the dignity that had defined his entire career, walking across the ring with the same measured pace that had carried him through every significant fight of his legendary journey. There was no gloating, no theatrical celebration, no playing to the crowd's shocked energy or attempting to capitalize on the dramatic moment for personal gain. He extended his hand to Seagal with the same respect he had shown every opponent throughout his legendary career, because Rocky understood something that the martial arts actor was just beginning to learn. Victory without grace is empty, and defeat faced with honor can be more valuable than any championship belt or movie contract. Seagal looked at the offered hand for a long moment, perhaps seeing for the first time the authentic character of the man who had just shattered his world with such definitive completeness. The hand belonged to someone who had earned every callus through honest training, every scar through real combat, every victory through genuine heart and determination, rather than through marketing, mystique, or manufactured reputation. It was the hand of a man who had faced the best fighters in the world and proven himself through actions rather than words, through results rather than claims. The handshake that followed lasted only seconds, but it represented a fundamental shift in both men's understanding of what strength really meant and how authentic power operated in the world. Rocky's grip was firm but not crushing, supportive but not condescending. The handshake of a champion who had experienced both victory and defeat and understood that both were temporary conditions that revealed character rather than creating it. His eyes held no judgment, no mockery, no sense of superiority over his defeated opponent, just the quiet acknowledgement of one warrior recognizing another's courage in stepping into the ring, regardless of the outcome. Seagal's hand trembled slightly, not from physical damage, but from the psychological impact of having his entire worldview restructured by a single punch from a man he had dismissed as inferior. The trembling wasn't fear or weakness. It was the physical manifestation of a mind trying to process a reality so different from his expectations that it challenged every assumption he had made about himself and his place in the world. His grip was hesitant, uncertain, the handshake of someone learning humility for the first time in decades. As they stood together in the center of the ring, the contrast between them became even more apparent to everyone watching. Rocky remained exactly who he had been before the fight, humble, respectful, focused on the craft of boxing rather than his own ego or the dramatic implications of what he had just accomplished. His victory hadn't changed him because he had never needed external validation to know his own worth. He was the same man who had entered the ring, just as he had been the same man after every victory and defeat of his legendary career. Seagal, however, was visibly transformed, his arrogance replaced by something resembling genuine introspection for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The cameras captured his face as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. If he could be so completely wrong about this, what else had he misunderstood about himself, about fighting, about the nature of true strength? The question was written in his eyes, etched in the lines of confusion and dawning awareness that replaced his former certainty. This was the beginning of a journey that would ultimately prove more valuable than any victory could have been. The post-fight interviews would be fascinating studies in human psychology and the different ways people respond to success and failure. Rocky, as always, was gracious and modest, crediting his training team and expressing genuine respect for his opponent's willingness to step into the ring. He didn't mock or belittle Seagal's martial arts background, didn't claim superiority over other fighting disciplines, didn't gloat about the dramatic nature of his victory. Instead, he focused on the eternal truth that every real fighter learns. The ring reveals character, and character cannot be faked, manufactured, or purchased. His words carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak about combat through decades of honest competition against the world's best fighters. "Steven showed real courage tonight," Rocky said during his post-fight interview, his voice carrying the same humble tone that had characterized every public appearance of his career. "It takes guts to step in there with anybody, and he did that. I respect him for it. Tonight was just about what happened in the ring for those few minutes. It don't say nothing about what kind of man he is or what he might accomplish tomorrow. Fighting teaches us all something about ourselves, and I hope what happened tonight helps him as much as it helped me." Seagal's interview, conducted 20 minutes after regaining full consciousness and clearing the medical protocols required after a knockout, was a masterclass in humility forced upon someone completely unaccustomed to experiencing it. Gone was the condescending tone that had characterized every public appearance for decades, the dismissive gestures that had become his trademark, the absolute certainty that had defined his public persona. In its place was something raw and honest, a man confronting the gap between his self-perception and reality, struggling to find words for an experience that had shattered every assumption he had made about himself. "I need to think about what happened here tonight," Seagal said slowly, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "I came in believing certain things about myself, about my abilities, about what I knew about fighting. Rocky showed me that I had a lot to learn. I'm not making excuses. He was the better man tonight, and I need to figure out what that means for everything I thought I knew about myself and about combat. This is going to change how I approach training, how I think about fighting, how I understand what real strength actually means." The broader implications of this fight rippled through both the entertainment and combat sports worlds immediately, creating shockwaves that would be felt for years to come. Every martial arts instructor who had claimed movie techniques would work in real fights suddenly found their students asking uncomfortable questions about effectiveness versus spectacle. Every boxer who had been dismissed as primitive or outdated felt vindicated by Rocky's demonstration of fundamental excellence. Every fan who preferred substance over style, authenticity over flash, had witnessed their beliefs confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. The fight became an instant cultural touchstone, referenced whenever discussions arose about the difference between image and reality. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Steven Seagal himself, who would spend the coming weeks and months processing not just his physical defeat, but his spiritual awakening to truths about combat, character, and authentic strength that his previous success had hidden from him. The man who entered the ring believing he was a master would leave it understanding that he was still very much a student, and that perhaps this realization was worth more than any victory could have been. The aftermath of the fight created a cultural earthquake that extended far beyond the arena walls. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from disbelief to vindication as millions of viewers processed what they had witnessed. The video of Rocky's knockout punch went viral within hours, shared by professional fighters, casual fans, and cultural commentators who recognized they had witnessed something historically significant. This wasn't just a boxing match result. It was a fundamental challenge to the manufactured mythology that had dominated action entertainment for decades. Professional fighters from every discipline weighed in with their analyses, and the consensus was unanimous. Rocky had demonstrated the timeless truth that fundamental skills, perfectly executed under pressure, would always triumph over flashy techniques without substance. UFC champions, Olympic boxers, and veteran trainers all praised the knockout as a textbook example of why authentic training and real competition experience could never be replicated in movie studios or theoretical demonstrations. The fight became required viewing in gyms worldwide, used as a teaching tool for young fighters tempted by shortcuts or convinced that complex techniques were superior to mastered basics. The entertainment industry faced its own reckoning as audiences began questioning other action movie myths. Stunt coordinators found themselves fielding questions about the realistic effectiveness of fight choreography, while martial arts schools experienced a surge in enrollment from students wanting to learn real fighting rather than movie techniques. The distinction between combat sports and combat entertainment became a topic of serious discussion in ways it had never been before, with Rocky's victory serving as the definitive proof that authenticity mattered more than presentation. Steven Seagal's personal transformation became almost as compelling as the fight itself. In the weeks following his defeat, he began training at a traditional boxing gym in Las Vegas, working with actual trainers rather than yes men, sparring with legitimate opponents rather than choreographed partners. His social media presence shifted dramatically. Gone were the boastful claims and mystical martial arts philosophy, replaced by humble posts about learning fundamental techniques and respecting the craft of real fighting. The change was so dramatic that many observers wondered if the knockout had literally rewired his personality. The most touching moment came 3 months after the fight, when Seagal appeared at a youth boxing program in Philadelphia that Rocky supported. He spoke to young fighters about the importance of humility, authentic training, and the difference between movie magic and real skill development. His message was simple but powerful. He had spent decades believing his own mythology, and it had taken one perfectly placed punch to teach him that true strength came from honest self-assessment and continuous improvement rather than assumed superiority. Rocky, characteristically, handled his victory with the same grace he had shown in defeat throughout his career. He used the renewed attention to promote youth boxing programs and speak about the values that combat sports could teach: discipline, respect, perseverance, and the understanding that everyone has something to learn from everyone else. He never mocked Seagal's previous arrogance or claimed superiority over other fighting disciplines, instead focusing on the positive aspects of what had occurred. 2 men testing themselves honestly, and both learning something valuable in the process. The fight's legacy extended into academic circles as well, with sports psychologists and sociologists analyzing what the bout revealed about celebrity culture, manufactured expertise, and the public's hunger for authenticity in an increasingly artificial world. University courses began using the fight as a case study in the difference between competence and confidence, skill and reputation, substance and style. The knockout punch became a metaphor for moments when reality cuts through illusion with devastating clarity. The financial impact was equally significant, as the pay-per-view revenue shattered records and both fighters earned more from this single bout than most athletes make in their entire careers. But more importantly, the fight proved that audiences were starving for genuine competition over manufactured drama, authentic skill over choreographed spectacle, real stories over scripted narratives. It opened doors for other crossover fights between legitimate competitors and entertainment figures, though none would ever match the cultural impact of Rocky versus Seagal. As the immediate aftermath settled into lasting influence, one truth emerged clearly. Sometimes it takes just one moment, one perfectly placed punch, one collision between reality and illusion to remind the world what authentic greatness actually looks like and why it matters more than any amount of manufactured mystique. 6 months after the fight that shocked the world, the true depth of its impact became clear in ways that extended far beyond combat sports or entertainment. The knockdown had become a cultural symbol, referenced in boardrooms, classrooms, and therapy sessions as an example of what happens when authentic competence meets manufactured confidence. Business schools began using the fight as a case study in the dangers of believing your own marketing, while leadership seminars cited Rocky's approach as the gold standard for quiet confidence backed by genuine skill. The transformation in Seagal continued to fascinate psychologists and personal development experts. His journey from arrogant movie star to humble student became the subject of documentaries and academic papers exploring the psychology of ego death and rebirth. Seagal himself embraced this new role, speaking at conferences about the dangers of unchecked ego and the liberating power of facing uncomfortable truths about yourself. His honesty about his previous delusions resonated with audiences who recognized similar patterns in their own lives. Rocky's approach to victory became a masterclass studied in leadership programs worldwide. His refusal to mock his defeated opponent, his immediate extension of respect and support, and his focus on the craft rather than personal glory demonstrated emotional intelligence that transcended sports. Corporate executives began adopting Rocky principles, the idea that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down, even in victory. His post-fight interviews were analyzed for their perfect balance of confidence without arrogance, pride without condescension. The fight's impact on martial arts instruction was revolutionary. Traditional schools that had relied on mystique and theoretical techniques found themselves forced to prove their effectiveness through practical application. The enrollment surge in boxing gyms came largely from martial artists who wanted to test their skills against fundamental striking techniques. Cross-training became not just popular, but essential, as fighters realized that flashy techniques meant nothing without solid fundamentals backing them up. Young athletes across all sports began referencing the fight when discussing the importance of authentic preparation over showmanship. The knockout punch became shorthand for what happens when substance meets style, when years of honest training face off against assumed superiority. Coaches use the bout to teach athletes about the difference between confidence and arrogance, skill and technique, preparation and assumption. The phrase "getting rockied" entered sports lexicon, meaning to be humbled by someone you'd underestimated. The entertainment industry's response evolved from initial shock to genuine introspection. Action movies began incorporating more realistic fighting choreography, with directors hiring actual fighters as consultants rather than relying purely on visual spectacle. The public's appetite for authenticity, awakened by Rocky's victory, began demanding more genuine performances and believable action sequences. Actors found themselves training with legitimate coaches rather than stunt coordinators, understanding that audiences could now distinguish between real skill and movie magic. Social media continued to amplify the fight's lessons, with motivational speakers and life coaches using the knockout as a metaphor for breakthrough moments in personal development. The image of Seagal rising from the canvas became a symbol of resilience and the ability to face hard truths about oneself. Rocky's calm dignity and victory represented the ideal response to success, grateful, humble, focused on continuous improvement rather than basking in momentary achievement. The psychological community found particular value in studying both fighters' responses to the outcome. Rocky's behavior demonstrated secure confidence, strength that didn't need to diminish others to feel powerful. Seagal's transformation showed the positive potential of what psychologists call necessary narcissistic injury, the healthy destruction of false self-image that allows for genuine growth. Their interaction became a template for how to handle both victory and defeat with grace and authenticity. Perhaps most significantly, The fight began changing how people viewed expertise and authority in their own lives. The obvious lesson that claimed expertise without proven results was worthless spread beyond sports into every field where people made bold claims without backing them up. Professionals found themselves being asked to demonstrate their competence rather than simply assert it, while consumers became more skeptical of marketing claims unsupported by verifiable results. The deeper truth that emerged was that authenticity, while sometimes less immediately impressive than manufactured spectacle, possessed a power that no amount of showmanship could replicate. Rocky's simple, honest approach to fighting and to life had defeated not just an opponent, but an entire philosophy of success built on image rather than substance. 1 year after the knockout heard around the world, the fight's influence had sparked what cultural commentators began calling the authenticity movement. The collision between Rocky's genuine skill and Seagal's manufactured mystique had awakened something deeper in global consciousness. A hunger for real substance over polished presentation, for earned expertise over claimed authority, for humble competence over arrogant assumption. The movement transcended sports, entertainment, and celebrity culture to become a fundamental shift in how people evaluated truth and value in every aspect of their lives. Universities worldwide began incorporating Rocky studies into their curricula, not as sports history, but as examination of authentic leadership, genuine expertise, and the psychological dynamics of confidence versus arrogance. Business schools analyze the fight as a perfect example of what happens when substance meets style, when proven competence faces theoretical knowledge, when years of honest work confront decades of unchallenged assumptions. The knockout punch became a metaphor used in everything from negotiations to product launches, representing moments when reality cuts through marketing with undeniable clarity. The transformation of Steven Seagal into an advocate for humility and authentic training continued to inspire people facing their own moments of reckoning. His speaking engagements filled auditoriums with individuals who recognized their own tendency towards self-deception and overconfidence. Seagal's message was consistent and powerful. True strength came from honest self-assessment, continuous learning, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths about your limitations. His journey from arrogant celebrity to humble student became a roadmap for personal transformation that resonated across cultures and professions. Rocky's influence extended beyond sports into philosophy and spirituality, with religious leaders and motivational speakers citing his approach as embodying ancient wisdom about strength through humility, victory through service, and power through authenticity. His refusal to mock his defeated opponent, his immediate offer of respect and support, and his focus on craft over ego became the foundation for workshops on conscious leadership and ethical success. The fight demonstrated that true champions elevate everyone around them, even those they've defeated. The medical and psychological communities found profound value in studying both men's responses to the fight's outcome. Rocky's behavior exemplified what researchers called secure excellence, competence that didn't need to diminish others to feel valuable. His post-victory interviews became textbook examples of healthy confidence, emotional intelligence, and authentic leadership. Seagal's transformation demonstrated the positive potential of what psychologists termed constructive ego dissolution, the beneficial destruction of false self-image that enables genuine growth and authentic self-understanding. Corporate America experienced its own reckoning as the fight's lessons penetrated boardrooms and leadership seminars. Companies began evaluating their own Seagal moments, times when they'd believed their own marketing, dismissed competitors as inferior, or assumed success based on past performance rather than current competence. The knockout punch became shorthand for market disruption, representing what happens when established players underestimate challengers who prioritize substance over style, effectiveness over presentation. The entertainment industry's evolution accelerated as audiences, inspired by their preference for Rocky's authenticity over Seagal's manufactured mystique, began demanding more genuine content across all media. Reality shows focused on real skill development rather than artificial drama. Action movies emphasized practical choreography over impossible stunts, and celebrities found themselves valued more for authentic expertise than manufactured personas. The fight had awakened the public's ability to distinguish between real and fake, and they were no longer satisfied with artificial substitutes. Youth programs worldwide adopted Rocky principles as their foundation, teaching young people that true success came from honest effort, continuous improvement, and respect for opponents rather than from self-promotion, shortcuts, or dismissing others as inferior. Boxing gyms reported unprecedented enrollment from students who wanted to develop the kind of fundamental competence that had proven superior to flashy techniques. The fight became a teaching tool for coaches across all sports, demonstrating that mastery of basics would always triumph over complex techniques without solid foundation. The fight's impact on social media culture was particularly significant, as people began questioning the difference between genuine influence and manufactured online personas. The knockout punch became a metaphor for moments when authentic content broke through algorithmic noise, when real expertise cut through influencer marketing, when substance finally overcame style in the attention economy. Users began seeking out content creators who demonstrated actual knowledge and skill rather than those who simply projected confidence and authority. International relations experts even began referencing the fight when discussing diplomatic strategies, noting how Rocky's approach, quiet strength, proven competence, respectful treatment of opponents, achieved better results than aggressive posturing or arrogant assumption of superiority. The bout became a case study in how authentic power, backed by demonstrable capability, commanded more respect than theatrical displays of supposed strength. 2 years after the punch that changed everything, the fight between Rocky Balboa and Steven Seagal had evolved from a sporting event into a cultural touchstone that defined a generation's understanding of authentic versus manufactured excellence. The bout was no longer remembered merely as a boxing match, but as the moment when society collectively awakened to the difference between substance and style, between earned respect and assumed authority, between genuine strength and theatrical power. Academic institutions worldwide had incorporated the fight into their standard curricula, with authenticity studies becoming a recognized field examining how genuine competence operates in contrast to manufactured expertise. The knockout punch was analyzed in philosophy classes as a perfect example of truth cutting through illusion, in psychology courses as a demonstration of secure confidence overcoming insecure arrogance, and in business schools as the ultimate case study of what happens when substance meets style in competitive environments. Rocky's approach to both victory and competition became the gold standard for leadership development programs across every industry. His combination of quiet confidence, proven competence, respectful treatment of opponents, and focus on craft over ego was taught as the ideal model for sustainable success. Corporate executives who adopted Rocky leadership principles reported better team performance, improved client relationships, and more authentic organizational cultures. His post-fight interviews were studied frame by frame as masterclasses in gracious victory and authentic communication. Steven Seagal's transformation from arrogant celebrity to humble advocate for authentic training became one of the most documented personal development journeys in modern history. His willingness to publicly examine his previous self-deceptions acknowledge his misconceptions about fighting and strength, and embrace genuine learning resonated with millions of people facing their own moments of necessary humility. Seagal's speaking circuit expanded globally as organizations invited him to share his insights about overcoming ego, facing uncomfortable truths, and finding genuine strength through authentic self-assessment. The fight's impact on combat sports was revolutionary and permanent. Traditional martial arts schools found themselves unable to rely on mystique and theoretical techniques, forced instead to prove their effectiveness through practical application and honest sparring. Boxing gyms experience sustained enrollment increases as fighters from all disciplines sought to develop the kind of fundamental competence that had proven superior to complex techniques lacking solid foundation. The phrase, "getting rockied," became standard terminology for being defeated by someone whose simple, well-executed basics overcame elaborate but ineffective techniques. Entertainment industry transformation accelerated as audiences, having developed more sophisticated taste for authenticity through the fight's influence, demanded genuine content across all media platforms. Action movies began emphasizing realistic choreography over impossible stunts. Reality shows focused on actual skill development rather than manufactured drama. And celebrities found themselves valued for demonstrable expertise rather than projected personas. The fight had permanently altered the public's ability to distinguish between real and artificial, and they were no longer willing to accept substitutes for authentic content. The psychological community continued finding new applications for the fight's lessons, particularly in treating narcissistic personality disorders and helping individuals develop secure rather than defensive confidence. Rocky's behavior became the template for healthy self-assurance, while Seagal's transformation demonstrated the positive potential of constructive ego dissolution. Therapy programs began using the fight as a visualization tool for clients learning to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and develop genuine rather than defensive strength. Youth development programs worldwide had fully integrated Rocky principles into their foundational teachings, with young people learning that sustainable success came from honest effort, continuous improvement, and respectful treatment of competitors rather than from self-promotion, shortcuts, or dismissive attitudes toward others. The fight became required viewing in character development curricula, demonstrating that true champions elevate everyone around them, including those they defeat. Social media culture experienced a fundamental shift as users, inspired by the fight's demonstration of substance over style, began gravitating toward content creators who demonstrated actual knowledge and practical skills rather than those who merely projected confidence and authority. The knockout punch became a metaphor for breakthrough moments when authentic content cut through algorithmic noise, when real expertise overcame influencer marketing, when genuine value finally triumphed over manufactured attention. The fight's influence on international business and diplomacy became increasingly apparent as organizations and nations began adopting Rocky's approach. Quiet strength backed by proven competence, respectful treatment of competitors, focus on actual results rather than theatrical presentations of power. The bout was referenced in diplomatic training programs as an example of how authentic capability commanded more respect than aggressive posturing or arrogant assumptions of superiority. Perhaps most significantly, the fight had fundamentally altered how people evaluated expertise and authority in their daily lives. The obvious lesson that claimed knowledge without demonstrated results was worthless had spread beyond sports into every field where individuals made bold assertions without backing them up with verifiable competence. Professionals found themselves required to demonstrate rather than merely assert their abilities, while consumers became permanently skeptical of marketing claims unsupported by authentic proof of effectiveness. 5 years after the knockout that redefined how the world understood authentic strength, the fight between Rocky Balboa and Seagal had transcended sports, entertainment, and even cultural commentary to become something approaching mythology. The bout was no longer discussed as a single event, but as a permanent reminder of timeless truths about character, competence, and the difference between genuine power and manufactured mystique. In classrooms, boardrooms, therapy sessions, and training facilities around the world, people continued to reference the moment Rocky reminded us what real strength looks like. The fight had become shorthand for a universal human experience, the moment when reality cuts through illusion with undeniable clarity, when substance defeats style, when earned expertise overcomes assumed authority. Every person could identify their own Rocky moment, times when they'd been humbled by someone they'd underestimated, or when they'd achieved something meaningful through honest effort rather than flashy presentation. The knockout punch represented every breakthrough moment when authentic competence proved superior to theoretical knowledge or manufactured confidence. Rocky's legacy extended far beyond boxing into the realm of timeless wisdom about how genuine strength operates in the world. His approach, quiet confidence backed by proven competence, respectful treatment of all opponents, focus on craft improvement rather than personal aggrandizement, had become the foundation for leadership development across every field of human endeavor. Business schools, military academies, medical programs, and educational institutions worldwide taught Rocky principles as the ideal model for sustainable excellence and authentic authority. Steven Seagal's transformation continued to inspire people facing their own necessary moments of ego, dissolution, and authentic growth. His journey from arrogant celebrity to humble advocate for genuine training demonstrated that even the most entrenched self-deceptions could be overcome through willingness to face uncomfortable truths. His global speaking circuit had evolved into a movement helping millions of individuals recognize and overcome their own tendencies toward false confidence, manufactured expertise, and dismissive attitudes toward others. The fight's influence on how society evaluated expertise and authority had become permanent and comprehensive. In every field, from medicine to technology, from education to entertainment, from politics to personal relationships, people had developed more sophisticated ability to distinguish between genuine competence and manufactured authority. The knockout punch had awakened a collective consciousness that demanded proof of effectiveness rather than assertions of superiority, demonstrated results rather than theoretical claims. Youth around the world grew up understanding that true success came from honest effort, continuous improvement, and respectful treatment of others, rather than from self-promotion, shortcuts, or arrogant dismissal of competition. The fight had become foundational viewing in character development programs, demonstrating that authentic champions elevate everyone around them, including those they defeat. Rocky's example taught young people that real strength was measured not by who you could defeat, but by how you treated others in both victory and defeat. The entertainment industry had permanently evolved, with audiences no longer satisfied with manufactured drama when authentic stories were available. Action movies emphasized realistic rather than impossible choreography. Reality shows focused on genuine skill development rather than artificial conflict, and celebrities found themselves valued for demonstrable expertise rather than projected personas. The fight had educated the public's taste, making them permanent advocates for substance over style across all media. Combat sports experienced lasting transformation as traditional martial arts adapted to prove their effectiveness through practical application rather than mystique and theory. Boxing gyms maintained unprecedented enrollment as fighters from all disciplines sought to develop the fundamental competence that had proven superior to complex techniques lacking solid foundation. The lesson was clear and permanent. Mastery of basics would always triumph over elaborate techniques without authentic understanding. The psychological and philosophical implications of the fight continued generating new insights about human nature, ego, and authentic power. Rocky's behavior remained the gold standard for secure confidence, strength that didn't need to diminish others to feel valuable. Seagal's transformation demonstrated the positive potential of constructive ego dissolution, the beneficial destruction of false self-image that enables genuine growth. Together, their story illustrated humanity's eternal struggle between authentic and manufactured identity. Corporate culture worldwide had integrated the fight's lessons about the difference between genuine leadership and authoritarian posturing. Organizations that adopted Rocky's approach, quiet competence, proven results, respectful treatment of competitors, focus on continuous improvement, consistently outperformed those relying on aggressive marketing, dismissive attitudes, or theoretical expertise without practical application. The knockout punch became a warning about what happened when companies believed their own marketing rather than focusing on actual customer value. International relations continued referencing the fight when discussing effective diplomacy versus aggressive posturing. Rocky's approach, demonstrable capability backed by respectful engagement, achieved better results than theatrical displays of supposed power or arrogant assumption of superiority. The bout remained a case study in how authentic strength commanded respect, while manufactured toughness ultimately provoked challenge and defeat. As the years passed, one truth became increasingly clear. The fight had reminded humanity of something essential that modern society had temporarily forgotten: that genuine power comes from authentic competence humbly applied, that true strength is measured by character rather than dominance, and that real champions lift others up rather than tear them down. Rocky's left hook had done more than knock out Steven Seagal. It had knocked sense back into a world that had begun confusing image with reality, style with substance, confidence with competence. The eternal lesson remained simple but profound. Authenticity always defeats artifice, substance always overcomes style, and earned respect always proves superior to assumed authority. In a world increasingly filled with manufactured personas and theoretical expertise, the fight served as a permanent reminder that nothing, absolutely nothing, could substitute for genuine competence applied with humble heart and respectful spirit. Rocky Balboa had reminded the world what real strength looked like, and that reminder would echo through generations, inspiring people to choose substance over style, authenticity over artifice, and earned respect over manufactured mystique. The knockout punch had become immortal, not because of its physical impact, but because of its eternal truth. Genuine champions don't just defeat opponents, they elevate everyone around them, including those they've overcome. This story reminds us that authenticity always defeats artifice, that humble skill triumphs over arrogant showmanship, and that sometimes the most important victories happen when we're forced to confront the difference between who we think we are and who we really are. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between real strength and manufactured toughness, drop a comment below and tell us about a time when reality hit you like Rocky's left hook. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started with stories that reveal the truth behind the legend.